Welcome everybody to the third webinar of the African City Food Month. It's titled Sustainable Food Cultures, How Our Appetites Can Shape Our Cities. My name is Solofina Nekesa. I'm a professional officer in urban systems at ICLEI Africa, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the African City Food Month campaign. Some of you are joining us from previous sessions, and you're welcome to join us again for this particular webinar. So as I've said again, it's titled Sustainable Food Cultures, How Our Appetites Can Shape Our Cities. First of all, just a note on webinar protocols. So this session is recorded, and therefore by participating, you're consenting to being recorded. We welcome active participation and discussions in the chat boxes. So please feel free to add your questions throughout the presentations and discussions. And then the recordings and outcome reports from this session will be shared with the registrants after the session. Thank you very much. And this is going to be very much an interactive session. And we want to know more about how you're interacting with food and how we are trying to understand food and its interaction with a city, or our cities interacting with food. So today we have quite an interesting lineup. We'll do first the introductory remarks. Then we'll have setting of the scene from the African Center for Cities podcast on what have you eaten today. Then we'll look at food cultures, and this is very much exploratory, as we do not exactly understand what food cultures are, but we have all individually interacted with food cultures at different levels. And I think we'd like to encourage you throughout this webinar to add your thoughts in the chat, in the Q&A, on how you've interacted with food in a cultural perspective. And then also looking at food as an element for driving sustainability in our cities. So we also we'll have a presentation on hidden flows in Kampala from Naibi Shot. And then we'll have a presentation from Kurt Ackerman from the SA Urban Food and Farming Trust, who will present on functional food cultures. So then we'll go into calls to better understand how you're interacting with food at a personal level, or what are some of the food choices that you're making. And then we'll have a video recording from Kimberly Addison on reimagining and valuing the African flavors. So Kimberly was not able to join us for this particular webinar, but we're able to conduct an interview, and we'll share this during the course of the webinar. And then we'll have closing remarks after that. Next. So our partners for African City Food Month, first of all, we have quite a strong partnership with Ricolto, with the South African Urban Food and Farming Trust, and Kurt Ackerman, who is presenting today, will introduce himself and some of the work that South African Urban Food and Farming Trust are doing. And then our partners are also African Center for Cities, RUAF, and then the Milan Urban Food and Policy Pact, and then the Ellen MacArthur Foundation. So the way we were looking at African City Food Month this year, it's part of the 2021 African Food Exchange that was aimed at elevating the voices of African cities towards the UN Food System Summit. And we've organized the engagements across different phases, where we're looking at phase one, which was engagements in different cities to identify and highlight the key stakeholders, the city priorities, and existing practices around urban food. And this we did across different cities in Africa, in Accra, in Antananarivo, Arusha, Cape Town in the south, Dodoma, Arusha, and Nairobi in the east, and then looking at Antananarivo as well, and Lilongwe and Kilimani. So it was quite a spread of cities across the region, and the idea was to understand what exactly is affecting the food systems, but to also identify what are the key practices and priorities that cities can work on to be able to transform their food system, and what partnerships are key for transforming the food system. And then phase two is what we are doing right now, trying to share and then also enable co-learning across the different cities. And then so moving forward, most of the learnings from these engagements will feed into the UN Food Systems Summit, and then we'll keep the momentum through the City Food Network and other platforms which are bringing together different stakeholders around food. So before I continue, please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat, where you are dialing in from to the webinar, and then also what organization you are working with. So why was this webinar important to us in this whole framework of these different dialogues that we've been having? I think first of all, we wanted to answer some key questions with this interaction today. One, we want to understand what is a sustainable food culture. And although we might leave with more questions than we've come with, but at least it's a beginning point of trying to understand what we mean by sustainability, food, and culture, because these are three important aspects that intersect and affect our everyday life. And then also understanding what are the meanings attached to food in our urban environments and how these are shaped over time. Then how do our choices around food shape and are shaped by the wider food system? And then what initiatives have the potential to ensure the cultivation of sustainable food cultures in our urban environment? So I hope that at the end of this webinar, we'll be able to share between the participants, but as well as the presenters on these key questions. And if there are more questions coming up, then this is an opportunity to investigate further and to learn from this. And during the last year's African City Food Month, we posed this question to our participants, what food do you enjoy eating? And this is what, interestingly, this is what came out from the survey. We saw that rice was very common, was very much enjoyed across the continent. So we saw pasta as well, chicken is coming through, then we saw plantain, we saw fish also, it's quite enjoyed. And then I can see matoke there as well. Then there's cheese, salmon. So, these are the foods that are really enjoyed on the continent. And it will be interesting from today's discussion, how do this link to really how do this link to our association with the wider access to food? Why do our choices sort of coming out strongly like this? And why is now the best time to talk about food in urban areas? And why is now the best time to discuss how we can shape our cultures to better shape our food system? I think most importantly, as we know, is that the utilization of cities has changed. And this could be particularly linked to the issues around population growth. And I'm looking at 3 cities, 2 in East Africa and Johannesburg. For example, Kampala City, the population in 2020 was 3.5 million urban dwellers, but in 2030 is projected to be 7 million. So that means that in this particular city, the population is going to double in a space of just under 9 years. And then for Johannesburg, in 2020, the population was estimated to be 3.5 million inhabitants, but in 2030, this is going to increase to 7 million inhabitants. And we're seeing the same trend happening for Addis Ababa. So then what does it mean in terms of what food or how much food is required, or how food should move through the cities to feed this ever-increasing urban population? And also interestingly, when we look at the historical colonial planning of African cities, food was never the idea behind when planning African cities. And I'll read an interesting excerpt from the planning of Nairobi City. And this goes, the principal revision to Abercrombie's guidelines was framed in the Nairobi plan as follows. So the neighborhood unit was thus formulated as something of a utopian oasis for dealing with this newness and as an educative space for molding Africans towards a new form of sociality which trumped other logics of placemaking, establishing the ruling logic or logos of the modern urban reframe, was to be facilitated and put into effect through a specific set of rules specified in the tenancy contract, which aimed to advance the normalization process. And what was normalization here? The normal use of the house. For example, no business activity, especially alcohol related, no lodgers, no house alterations, the free right of entrance for social workers, then the normal use of the house plot. So that meant no livestock or tall crops, then normal behavior, that meant no immoral activities or nuisance to neighbors. And I think what strongly stands out for me here is the issue of no livestock or tall crops. So the idea is that the housing unit or housing planning or planning in cities was meant to be clean and not messy. And the fact that food was not initially planned to be part of the city. We're seeing these effects pulling through strongly in how African cities are developing, with less and less space for the flow of food, but then also for the access and production of food as well. So then we're also looking at the disappearance of the connection between city dwellers and the source of their food. And with this, also the knowledge of agriculture and food spares no longer being direct, but instead is mediated by the media. Then there's the impact of modernization and urbanization on the way we prepare and consume food. Indigenous way of preparing food, communal way of eating and sharing. These are all changing due to the nature of the urban spaces. And then the transformation of a reign of consumption. So sharing food at home versus sharing food in restaurants and the impacts on social relationships. And then there's an increase in the neglect of indigenous foods. The diet has narrowed down and it's impacting on health and environment. And then issues around food waste, where consumers demands, where consumers demands as well as lack of access to traditional methods of food preservation, among others, are severely impacting the way we look at food or the way we value food. And so with that, I would like, as we hear the discussions today, we should be able to place a personal food system in the context of all these other factors that affect how we look at food, that influence our access to food, as well as our food-related behavior. And here, our personal food system, I'm referring to, first of all, our health and well-being, our relationships and connections, the convenience and of how we access food, as well as the taste with which we associate food. And to me, this contains a wide range of other actors of our personal food system, what influences our personal choices to food, and really how this is overall shaped by the food system. And I think the challenge for today's webinar is to move away from being passive actors into the food system, and now we can push back from our personal food system to be able to influence food access, to be able to influence food relational behavior, as well as influence the micro context, as well as the macro context of the food system. So with that brief introduction, I would like to play a podcast, what have you eaten today? A reflection on the decisions around food and how these shape our food system. So thank you very much for joining us today. Please post your questions in the chat. Feel free to engage as well as interact with our presenters throughout the webinar.
And the African Centre for Cities at UCT. Hello, my name is Jane Battersby. I'm a food researcher from the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science and the African Centre for Cities at UCT. At the African Centre for Cities, we've been working on food security and food systems in African cities since about 2007. And this is the Planning for Food Secure African Cities podcast. It's a podcast series designed to help African planning scholars and urbanists to think about how and why food can be incorporated into urban planning and governance. If you're not a planner, please don't switch off. If you listen along, you'll find out about how looking at the city through food gives us a unique lens to understand the histories, presents, and futures of our cities. So what have you eaten today? Seems like a mundane question. One that's probably quite far removed from your thinking about planning and about city governance. But what have you eaten? It seems like an inconsequential question, but it's probably one of the most important decisions that you're going to make each day.
I'm sorry about that. I'm getting some questions that there's no sound, so I'm going to share that again. Then we can proceed. Thanks. All right, so I'm going to attempt to share again, and I hope you can hear the sound this time.
A series designed to help African planning scholars and urbanists to think about how and why food can be incorporated into urban planning and governance. If you're not a planner, please don't switch off. If you listen along, you'll find out about how looking at the city through food gives us a unique lens to understand the histories, presents, and futures of our cities. So what have you eaten today? Seems like a mundane question. One that's probably quite far removed from your thinking about planning and about city governance. But what have you eaten? It seems like an inconsequential question, but it's probably one of the most important decisions that you're going to make each day, every day. What you eat every day shapes your health, shapes your well-being, shapes your mental well-being. It connects you or disconnects you from your culture. It connects or disconnects you from your family. It shapes the health and development of your children. So what have you eaten today? This seemingly mundane question also then fundamentally shapes our cities. As legendary foods policy activist Wayne Roberts from Canada writes, more than with any other of our biological needs, the choices we make around food affect the shape, style, pulse, look, feel, health, economy, street life, and infrastructure of the cities. So the way in which we eat is shaping our cities. The way in which we eat is shaping our lives. The way we eat is shaping our economies. But still, what does this have to do with planning? What does it have to do with city governance? Well, let's stop and think about why you eat what you eat. To what extent is that simply shaped by your personal choices? Or to what extent is it shaped by your finances? And to what extent is it shaped by the kind of city that you live in? Think about it. Where do you buy the food you buy? Why are those particular kinds of retailers present? Why do you buy what you buy? How much of that is shaped by your daily mobility? How much is that shaped by the kinds of employment that your city offers? How do you cook what you cook? To what extent is that shaped by the reliability of your energy supply, the reliability of your water supply, the quality of water? What about the quality of housing and how that shapes your consumption practices? Do you grow any of your own food? What's the zoning around that? Do you buy food produced by large processors or from small industries? What's the planning and governance of that? You see, as you start to unpack the decisions that you make about food, you can see how many of these are fundamentally shaped by planning and regulations and policies that shape our food system and also shape our daily lives in our cities. And so this podcast is designed to help us think through planning, policies, and regulations in relation both to food systems and our ability to use those systems. We'll be drawing on work from the Consuming Urban Poverty Project, the Nourishing Spaces Project, the Nourished Child Project, and other work that's happening on the African continent.
Thank you for listening in, and I think right now is the time that we want to pose the questions to you. What have you eaten today? And we'll do this through poll questions. My colleagues Netemba will share a couple of questions in the chat, and let us know how you're interacting with your food. What are the choices you're making around food? So I'll hand this over to Snev right now.
Thank you, Solo. Good day, everyone. Just to begin off, I would like for... Okay, please just give me a moment.
The link to join the Mentimeter is in the chat. You can either click on the link
that again.
or you can go to www.menti.com and use the password.
I have sent the link again for everyone. Please try access so that we can start with the poll questions.
Okay, we can start with the poll questions now. Okay, looks like we have quite a spread of people joining us today. And the majority seems to be joining from South Africa. I see some coming in from Eastern Africa, though I can't tell if you're from Uganda, if you're from Kenya or Ethiopia. At least someone joining in probably from Italy. So you're all welcome, and thanks for indulging us. Do we still have other people adding to the Mentimeter? Please feel free to let us know where you're joining in from. Okay, so we can go to the next question. Welcome, everyone. I can see Kaganga John is joining in from Uganda. Welcome to the webinar. Then Findru Moses, hello from Uganda as well. Welcome. And so this is the question, I think that is also important. You know, what did you eat today? And it could have been at breakfast, it could have been at lunch, it could have been a snack. Okay, I can see orange is taking center stage. Could this be because of the belief in the levels of vitamin C in oranges, and especially now that we're trying as much as possible to boost our immunities due to the COVID-19 pandemic? I can see also oats is coming through strongly. Banana, baguette and patisserie. Bean, eggs, veggie, banana is coming up again. Beans and maize. So someone has posted in the chat, ate a mixture of cassava and beans, katogo. There's also matoke, rice and beans, corn coming through strongly. So I think what's coming up here, it's oats and orange strongly. And then I can see mealie pap, meat pie. It's quite an interesting mix. Soybean sprout soup. Banana bread, tea, orange. Okay, now thanks for sharing. Can we please go to the next poll question? So what is your strongest association of a moment in your life and food? For example, a moment, you can enter this in the poll as a moment, dash and food, and then my 20th birthday, and then dash cassava, hot dogs. So we're seeing a post in the chat. There's been cassava, avocado, fresh maize. Someone has posted my birthday cake when I was 16. And there's also something about celebration, coming together, family time. And I think this is really where food does play a strong role in connecting families, in connecting friends. Someone has also inserted a traditional wedding and how they strongly associate with matoke. Then there's US Thanksgiving holiday, and also this still speaks to people coming together around food. Christmas dinners, flaming Christmas pudding made by my grandmother, And here we're also seeing that personal linkages of different people and different types of food. So chicken soup when I was sick as a child, then my food competition in high school. Oh, Mr. Food competition. Oh, I would like to, to hear more about the Mr. Food competition. So what's really coming out strongly is that, you know, food is linked to people. Food is linked to really very strong moments in our life. And this can be traditional, these are cultural moments, or these are, you know, fun moments with friends and also at school. So then we do not take food lightly because it relates to our personal health and well-being. So then how can we move this forward into how we can push for food to be made central into our cities with the same meaning, you know, food as a way of bringing people together, food as a way of celebration. Then one last question before we can move on. What is the strongest association of a city and food? You know, for example, the city, dash, and food. Here is Kampala and the Rolex. So you're seeing Nairobi and Nyama Choma. Nairobi is really very famous for some of the best Nyama Choma, Durban and samosas, community gardens. Accra is Banku and tilapia. Ginger, the original Rolex. Someone has just has just had to add the word original in ginger. And then having nothing, no money, and then sitting on the side of eating your last ration and chips. These are cafe chips. Then Kuala Lumpur food courts, steam, fire, and smell. Seoul, Korean barbecue. Then local markets around the world. So these are the spaces and places in which our memories about food have been formed in particular cities. And every time we think about the cities, memories of these cities, some of these foods do come to mind. And I think what I was curious to find out is how many African cities are showing up and what are those particular foods that we associate with them. And I can tell that Nairobi and Nyama Choma are really placed well together. There's something coming in the chat, Lagos and Suya. And then millet bread, kalo. All right. Thank you very much for sharing on what your associations with food are, both at a personal level, but then also in terms of spaces and places. And I think as we discuss further from our different presenters today, we'll be able to put some of this in context. First of all, trying to understand what the culture around food is, but then also what initiatives can be done in cities to shape food. How can we make our association with food more functional and inclusive in cities to drive the formation of inclusive cities for everyone. So thank you very much, and I will hand this over to Daniel Adeni, who will present on an exploration of what food culture is.
Great. Thank you, Solofina. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can. Go ahead, Daniel.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone, or good day, wherever you are joining us from. It's a pleasure to present this to you today. Like I always say, food is our common ground. So I love talking about food because we cannot do without food. And so essentially, I'm going to be speaking to what food culture entail. We did a little bit of exploration of what it is, and I'll be speaking to that. From the word food culture, we all know there's two things, food and culture. And how can we combine these together to get food culture? So when we want to talk about food, food is essentially, or maybe I should say that we cannot limit it to the tangible substance that we take in for life and growth, but we must also consider the context and the situation in which we take them. I believe that is very important. Also, in terms of culture, it evokes two complementary dimensions of individual and collective ethical knowledge, which constructs social values. So it's essentially, we're talking about the individual ethical knowledge that someone has and the collective ethical knowledge that people possess, and how they use this to shape the values that they hold as individuals or as a collective in the society. So looking at food culture, it essentially refers to the practices, attitudes, and beliefs, as well as the networks and institutions surrounding the production, distribution, and consumption of food. Another author defines it as the totality of uses. In other words, whatever we may use food for, totality of traditions around food, totality of practices around food, norms, situation. In other words, when we talk about norms, what are those things that you must not do when you are eating? Talk about etiquette. It forms, so sometimes, and it varies from one society to another. This is essentially the definition of food culture that we were able to get. I don't know if you have any definition. I will invite you to use the chat box. And what do you understand by food culture? What do we mean by food culture? Like we said, it's an exploratory discussion. So you can please tell us what you understand by food culture by using the chat box. Essentially, when we look at the structure of food cultures, it stands on three tripartite things, and I'm going to allude to them very quickly. Number one, and I must say that these three things are very much related. They are interconnected. They are complementary. You cannot say you want to take one without taking the other. So the first one is about the traditional recipes and know-how that are passed from generation to generation, and which forms the core of our collective identity. So in Chinese, what are those recipes that in China, what are those recipes that they use when we talk about food? In Africa, what are those recipes? Maybe in Kenya, how do you prepare matoke? In Uganda, what are those things that you must include? They are passed on from generation to generation. That is the first thing. The second thing is the practices and consumption habits, which is based on an identity. So essentially where I come from, and I will allude to that, I'm from Nigeria, the southern part of Nigeria, and we believe in eating very spicy food. Someone alluded to suya there. Suya is very spicy. And so when we relate with spicy, hot and spicy food, we relate it to someone that is very strong. If you are eating, they say, oh, that is a strong man there. But if you cannot take such a thing, this is a weak person. He or she cannot take hot and spicy things. That is the kind of identity that we form. And the third one is that food cultures, or food entirely, is an integral part of our culture. In other words, we cannot separate food from culture. When you get to some places, essentially, when they talk about food, they are talking about their culture. And when you ask some people about the culture, how do you do things here? They will eventually relate to food. And so it is an integral part of culture. In other words, it is inseparable from culture. And that's why we have food cultures. One thing that I must also emphasize is that it is both static. We talk about food cultures. There are some things that will not change. When we talk about food cultures, we know them that, okay, this is it. The Chinese, they use chopsticks to eat. In some part of Africa, we use hands to eat some kind of food. That is not changing. And some things that are also evolving. And I will also allude to that very quickly. When we talk about features of food cultures, we are talking about what are those features of food cultures. Number one is that they are constantly evolving. And especially, I think Solofina alluded to that with the urbanization that we have now and cities constantly growing, we see that the food cultures within cities, they are constantly evolving. And we are particularly aware of them. In other words, we know what to do. We know about our etiquette. This is how we do things in our culture. And thirdly is that they function as a platform for building identities. I want to talk very quickly about food, the individual and the society. What are those things how can we relate with food? How can we relate food to an individual? How can we relate food to the society? Number one thing that I want to emphasize is that it is used to facilitate our everyday life interaction. So basically you are done with work or maybe the lunch break at work, you're hanging out with your colleagues from work and you begin to talk about other things. You begin to talk about things that are going on in the society when you're having lunch. So you use it to facilitate everyday life interaction. Another thing is that local food culture gives people an identity. What you learn about food of the people you visit is also what you learn about their culture. That's why I said you cannot separate food from the culture of people. And it helps to tell the stories of the people within those cultures. Like I said, in some part of Africa, they believe in eating some kind of food, pap, with their hands. And so there are stories, and you must also eat it with your right hand. Why? Because they said it is hygienic to do that. And so if you try to eat it with your left hand, in some culture, they begin to talk about it. No, you don't do that. And food is also collectively used to nurture shared senses of cultural identity and economic livelihoods. Another thing that's why food is important, that people's identities are appropriated through food, and they can be transformed through engagement with food cultures. Another thing is that in urban centers, people perceive their positioning in relation, using culinary practices in relation with class, gender, and ethnicity. So in some spaces, you see when they are eating that, oh, when you look at them, you know that, oh, this is this ethnic group eating there. In urban centers, oh, this is this ethnic group eating there because of the way they. And one thing that food practices they use it to do is you can use it to illuminate social processes. In terms of exclusion, are you welcome into this environment? When you see some people gathering to eat, you know whether you can be welcome into that environment or whether it's a space where exclusion is being done. And it's also being used to illuminate acceptance. For instance, when you visit some family in Africa settings, for them to welcome you, they welcome you with a very good meal, which speaks to acceptance within that cycle. I want to talk now move quickly to talk about food cultures and the city. And I think Solofina talked about this earlier, that as cities are transforming, the ways in which we eat food and procure food is changing, along with the socio-cultural meanings of food itself. So we are in the era of the microwave age, where you basically just throw the food into the platform, and then it generates, and then within 2 minutes it's done. But then, it also affects the way we relate with food. Because some people, they have a love for food that they see it more as just eating, just to satisfy my cravings. They relate more with it, but with the changing environment, things are also changing. And what we also see is that there are migrative food practices. Ethiopians that migrate to South Africa, they bring their food culture with them and they begin to eat injera. You go to some places, I visited a friend, we went to Cape Town, we said we wanted to have matoke from Kenya, from Uganda. So essentially, we know that food cultures can also be used to highlight the shifting nature of urban infrastructures, governance, frameworks, and tensions that come to the fore as an outcome of everyday urban encounters. Why urban planning and design influences food cultures. For instance, the influence of the development of highways and malls in eating practices of people. Because we have highways now, because we have malls, this is also changing the way we view food, the way we relate with food. So essentially, sometimes you prefer to just say, I was telling my colleagues that, before you invite your friends to your house to eat and things like that, but then because of the development of malls, of restaurants, things are changing now. I can just put a call to my friends. Can we meet at this joint to have suya together? These are the way urban design, the design of malls, design of highways are changing the way we relate with food. Food practices also in turn shape urban environment. For instance, I'm not sure people that are familiar with Long Street in Cape Town and its nighttime economy, its glow and aesthetics. when you take food out of the equation of Long Street, then I don't think Long Street will still be Long Street. And for those who have also visited Langa in Cape Town, you know the association Langa has with food when they begin to do braai and all of that, and the vibe that it brings to that environment, it transforms that environment. So our food practices, they have the ability to transform our environment. And I just want to leave us with these provocative questions, even as our cities are developing, as our cities urbanize. What will be the future aspiration of the cities, of our cities, and how will this clash with or support certain food cultures? Number two, to what extent will these food cultures shape the future aspiration of our cities? How do we think that our food cultures are going to shape the aspirations of our cities? Number three is that, do the future aspirations of our cities have immediate space and recognition for indigenous food? Do they have recognition and space for street food, for migrating food? These are things that we need to think critically about. And that's why I'm posing these questions, are provocative questions. For collective eating practices, do our future aspirations of our cities, do they have space and recognition for this? And finally, will the future aspiration of our cities embrace both the complementary feature of food cultures, that is being static and evolving? There are some things that will not change. Will the aspiration of our cities embrace both? When I say static, it means that this is what we do and it's not going to change. And the second one is that the evolving aspect of it, will it embrace both, or will it neglect one at the expense of the other? These are my provocative questions that I would like us to continue to ruminate about. If you have answers to these questions, you can put it on your chat box. And I think I will stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Daniel, and for leaving us with more questions than answers. My feeling was that you're going to give us a bit of solutions, but it doesn't seem like it. But thank you for giving us that point of view. And as we earlier noted, is that, you know, this is an exploration webinar. You know, how do we perceive food? How do we think food is influencing our everyday life? But then also us as not as passive actors in the food system, but how can we influence how our cities are shaped by our food choices, but by also how we access, how we produce, and then how we interact with others around food. So with this, I would like to hand this over to Kurt Ackerman from South African Urban Food and Farming Trust to also share some of the work that the trust is doing, especially around functional food cultures. Welcome, Kurt.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucia. And thank you, Daniel. That was very helpful. And I think I only have to say half of what I was intending to say. So we can move rather quickly. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. I've got some slides and I'm going to be doing a little bit of storytelling from my own experience. So my background is really very much as an implementer on the ground and not the academic perspective. Sorry, I'm just going to, there we go. If you're not seeing the full screen slide, please someone let me know. Otherwise, I'll assume everything is fine. So I'm just going to bring some, sorry?
It's all working fine. Thanks.
Good, thank you. So I'm just going to bring some ideas and experiences from the work that we've been doing in Langa. And thank you very much, Daniel, for the lead into Langa. There's an incredible vibe. It's a little bit diminished with the pandemic, but being kind of braai and street food and so on, it's got more of a life than in some other communities, which has been lovely. So my organization is the South African Urban Food and Farming Trust. We work through food and farming to strengthen community cohesion. And over the last couple of years, we've moved more strongly into kind of direct interventions in some of the hard aspects of our broken food system as well. So I'll talk a little bit about that. So this is where my introduction to kind of being a bit of a food systems nerd or activist began. I've always been involved in the food system because I eat. I also love to cook, but down the road from where I live is a neglected bowling green that was a problem site for many years. And the community identified this and made some effort to clean it up. And this is the cleaned up look. And then I got involved in starting a community food garden. So really my motivation had nothing to do with the food system. It was more about a community effort that would help me and my wife and our son kind of find the village in the city, which we weren't finding in our living pattern. And after a few years, in the bottom right corner, you'll see what the food garden looked like. We had an incredible response. The demand, the interest in this kind of hands-on activity was tremendous. And we created an identity called the Oranjezicht City Farm, and Oranjezicht is the name of the suburb that we live in. And it has an incredibly beautiful location at the foot of Table Mountain and is probably one of the most photogenic places as an urban food garden. And one of the real learnings was not just that so many people wanted to come out and volunteer and get involved, but that there were other kind of natural outgrowths of the food gardening effort because people wanted to eat. And we couldn't grow enough to feed everyone. And so we started a little market in the adjacent park, and that took off like mad. But it started to shift the food culture because here was this node of access. We were bringing in food from other organic community food gardens and elsewhere. We were providing seeds and seedlings. There was someone who was talking about food foraging and indigenous foods, and you could taste them. And so it started to shift aspects of our food culture within this community. And people came from far and wide. In fact, we got in trouble and we got kicked out of the park. But it's okay, we landed on our feet on a 3,000 square meter site at the V&A waterfront, a very different place, but it started to have a very different impact as well. The market is ordering from 35 local smallholder commercial farmers. It supports over 80 artisanal food producers. So another outlet for the kinds of food that is produced that wouldn't necessarily make it into the mainstream food system. And that's had a substantial impact on our understanding of the food system and what's possible in terms of interventions and activism in a practical way. We also, back at our initial farm, we started to rent out little patches to people. These are largely affluent people who are living here. The people who are renting have a flat, they don't have space, and they're renting a little 6 square meter patch really is a lifestyle or a hobby activity. But for many, there's more to it than that. They want to grow the leafy greens, the herbs. They want to learn to grow. They want to involve their kids. So it was a very important outlet for people to get more involved hands-on in their food systems and not just be consumers. We also encourage people to come and pick their own harvest. So our farmers, one of whom is pictured there, were doing all the growing, but people could come in and be taught when a cabbage head is tight enough to harvest, or how do you harvest kale versus chard, or when is an eggplant big enough, and so on. And also that started to change people's engagement with their system, the food system, because they didn't just have to go down to the shop and buy something already harvested. They had to make their own choices and so on. And then we also started to facilitate these long table meals. Here's our farm team having a lunch a couple of years ago, but bringing people together through food. And it really opened our eyes to a lot of the potential of urban community food gardening. And we established kind of a broader organization called the South African Urban Food and Farming Trust, which tried to take a lot of those insights, networks, experiences, failures, resources we were able to marshal and start to make a more intentional difference in other communities. I mean, we started without a plan. We started with a piece of ground and some volunteers. And now we wanted to have a bit of a plan. And we reached out and got involved in a number of existing food gardens. One food garden on the grounds of a psychiatric hospital where the forensic patients work in the garden as part of their therapeutic regimen. And we helped with fundraising for infrastructure and also to help the psychiatrists and the occupational therapists learn how to actually run a farm, because they were great at the therapy, but they were pretty terrible at running a farm. And that's been going for a number of years now and is very successful. We also got involved at public schools, bringing in raised beds and working with environmental clubs and linking food gardening and the mathematics programs. And that's been a tremendous learning experience and success. We got involved with an NGO that helps homeless people get back on their feet and off the streets called Streetscapes. And that's also been incredibly successful. We got involved in the gang-ridden community of Lavender Hill. That was a bit more difficult. And I have to say, we're not continuing to be involved, but there is continued to be food gardening going on there. Also with some of the cowboy farmers on the edge of Dunoon under the high power lines and engaging with them, and in the community of Langa. And this is a food garden we've been working with for several years, run by a small Rastafarian community. It's called Kanisa Garden. And we had been working in Langa for a couple of years and unfortunately had to back away from Kanyisa because their structures burned down. And they stopped planting and all of their efforts went into rebuilding their organization, their community, which had scattered. And so our relationships in Langa led us to identify other places where we might have connections. And this is Laertoli Food Garden, where we wound up having a stronger connection. And the opportunity arose to really take hands with a local community development nonprofit called Masake Foundation, and to think about a more intentional role for community food gardens in community development and addressing food security directly. It was that imperative to address the hard needs to the softer needs of community development and social cohesion. And of course, the pandemic made that all too obvious as something that needed to be done. We were already going down that path, but thankfully we had already started. And so we had an insight of sorts, which is that there is a missing intermediate infrastructure, a component in the local food system that blocks these community food gardens from actually playing a more impactful role in shaping their food system and, as a corollary, their food culture. So we got involved more intensely in the community of Langa. So the circle on the left is where our first farm was, and the second is where we took hands with Masake and the 15 farmers who were working in the site to help strengthen the Laertoli Food Garden and to establish something that we refer to as a food haven. It's a combination of an agri-hub and a food hub. It's got infrastructure and supplies to support urban food gardening, and it also is a pack shed and a point of market access to help the commercial activities of these food gardens to kind of realize greater income and more sustainability. So the community of Langa is, as you can see, probably fairly centrally located in Cape Town. It's the oldest Black township established over 100 years ago by the colonial system. The 2011 census indicated 52,000 residents in 17,000 households. Roughly half of them earned less than 1,600 Rand a month. I mean, that's well below a subsistence level of income, and about 60% lived in formal housing. So that may sound fairly bleak, but compared to other so-called townships in Cape Town, Langa is quite open, quite stable, settled with formality. And since 2011, a large number of additional formal housing units have been built, and the informal either backyard dwellings or shack dwellings have been rebuilt in these formal structures. So this is the kind of older housing, single dwelling, but semi-detached, people taking some pride, but you see the razor wire. People are struggling, but they're not down and out. And there is very much a cultural component. This is the Arts and Culture Center in the heart of Langa called Gugsitebe. And it is an indication of the kind of cultural vibe that Daniel was talking to. Here it's about arts, but it extends to many aspects of life. And what we wanted to really understand for our work is, what's it going to take if we put a kind of a hub like this in place? Who is out there to use it? What are the real needs? So rather than go out and build something, we went out and talked to the prospective users of this, some of whom we knew, but we needed a much more rigorous approach. So we contracted a permaculturalist, an amazing woman named Huma Mtoy, and she is on a one-year contract visiting every single food garden in Langa. She gets on her bicycle and she goes around and engages with the ones that she sees and asks others for the ones that she can't see. She's been at this now for about 2 months. The rigorous part of it, already identified 23 food gardens in this 3 square kilometer community, and there are dozens more. So we're anticipating more than 50 will be ultimately identified. And this is some of her in the field and the kind of sites she's working with. And she's been working on data gathering through a very interesting platform called ONA, and I recommend it for anyone who needs to do similar kinds of things. It's open source, it's free, it's very easy to use, to set up. There are different roles. One can enter data on a smartphone app called ODK Collect. It's free to download on any phone platform, and one can capture data and then finalize it later. So one doesn't need to use mobile data to submit the information, but rather can be stored on the phone and then synced later. It's very versatile. And we're also working with others who have used it before to consolidate data sets around the community of Langa. So that's a very interesting kind of side effect. So what we've been able to do is plot these are just some of them. The red circles would be too many if I put them all on, but some of the sites in Langa where there are known food gardens. And what we looked for was that site that could connect them all and be practical. So the site at the Laertoli Food Garden for the Food Haven is within walking distance of each of these. I mean, all of Langa can be within walking distance, but it's quite central. and it's along main roads that are not they're main enough to be accessible and well maintained, but not a main thoroughfare. So they're safe and practical. And if one looks at the distances that people would walk to get to and from the site, if one just walks with something on one's shoulder or to the wheelbarrow, or even with a bicycle because it's very flat, it's even easier. This is what we're looking at, less than 20 minutes walk from anywhere in Langa. And so the site is here. As I've mentioned before, it's been gardened by a group of food gardeners for, in some cases, over 20 years. And what we've done with the Masake Foundation is take hands with these food gardeners and really go through a co-creative process where we unpack what their needs are and their ambitions and their aspirations and the roles that they'd like to play. So these are a couple of views of the site. Here's another one. And it really is a site also for engagement by the various farmers who are working the site. Some of them are connected to each other, others become connected. It's intergenerational, not only grandmothers and their grandchildren, but youths in their 20s and people with formal jobs who work in the evenings or on the weekends, and others who are trying to upskill themselves to look for economic opportunities. And so we facilitated a number of workshops, socially distanced and so on, and identified some of the needs and started to do that as a way of getting some momentum going. We rehabilitated an old well point. We took them on some site visits to other places. Here's an aggregation setup, a pack shed elsewhere. We secured the volunteer services of a landscape architect to kind of capture on paper what the needs and ambitions of the farmers were, and came up with a design that will transform this site from what it looks like in that above photo, which is what a typical summer might look like when there's no rainfall, before they had that well point rehabilitated, into a much more lush and diversified gardening site, along with some important infrastructure that is the food haven. So here we're talking storage for the inputs that people would need, seeds, seedlings, compost, chicken pellets, compost making, those kinds of things. And then also a pack shed, so that when there were people from this food garden, but also the others in Langa who wanted to sell, they could bring it to one area and everyone didn't have to have wash, pack, cold storage, and so on. And there are many other benefits that come from that. So for example, we're in the process of establishing a shade house that will ultimately look something like this. This is not it yet, we're not that far. And also the pack shed with aggregation that will look like this. So washing basins and drying racks, and really a properly set up, quite robust system. And the real question is, how will this hub impact the food system? I mean, that's the core question for us. And while in red, we've mapped some of the food gardens, in yellow, we started to map some of the other nodes in the food system. So hawkers, the street food vendors who are doing the braai, the restaurant schools, micro agro processors, the more formal food traders. And we've analyzed kind of what some of the impacts of shifting this into more of a kind of a circular economy might do. So we have flows of food in these groups. These circles in yellow are largely importing food from the Cape Town Fresh Produce Market, which is the big food market in Cape Town for the trade, for wholesale. And most of that produce comes from mainstream commercial farmers in and around Cape Town or further afield. They're growing in industrial monoculture, mechanized, with chemicals, and that's the food that's being brought into Langa. And so the green lines is the money being exported from Langa when they bring that food in. And so if someone looks at making these connections, then of course one starts to see the food that is going from the food hub or the food haven in the middle out to the yellow circles, which are the users of this food, the buyers of the food. And so for a certain portion of the fresh food, that can be sold to the local street traders, the restaurant schools, the feeding schemes, the schools, and so on. It won't be 100%, but it'll start to make a difference. And of course, the money will start to flow. Sorry, we also would like to grow that increasingly. And then the money will also start to flow from the yellow food producers into the food gardens themselves. So that's really the plan. And of course, we'd like that money to also increase, and we'd like to diminish the amount of imported food and the amount of exported money to strengthen that circular economy. And so just to give you a sense of what some of these nodes look like, in the upper left corner is a well-known restaurant. Maybe Daniel's talking about this, Jordan's Ways of Cooking, an internationally known chef who came back home to Langa and has opened a very vibey, great restaurant there. We've got Ichilele Langa, which is being produced from locally grown chilies and sold. We have the mainstream kind of big box retailers in the two corners, ShopRite and Boxer. We have a local diner, we have a cookery school, we have the the street food, we have the fruit and veg vendor, we have a small restaurant. So a diversity of different food nodes we've engaged with and gotten a sense from them of would they buy, how much would they buy, importantly, would they bring their food waste back, and can we work with that, and so on. And then we've also reached out and are working with others on our radar. So there are networks of networks that are important to connect with, because as Daniel said, the food culture does not stand in a vacuum. And so the Early Childhood Development Forum, for example, you may not think about them in the food system. They do a little bit of feeding in their feeding schemes, but they want to start 34 food gardens adjacent to every one of their ECDs. And that would not quite double the number of food gardens in Langa. So one never knows where these kind of networks are actually going to start to have an impact within the food system. All right, so all of that is really by way of getting to then what are the impacts on food culture? Because I've talked about food infrastructure, food gardens, food flows. And for us, this is all about shaping the food culture for the benefit of the residents of Langa, to increase awareness, not just of food supply, but their sources. What are the choices? What are the impacts and relevance of their choices? To strengthen their agency within the local food system. What they buy and where they buy it can make a difference. If they grow, it can make a difference. They can get involved. They don't just need to be passive consumers. Even if they grow a chili plant, they can learn to grow, they can get a seedling and they can grow it. It changes their relationship to the food system. They understand the link of food to income. There are people that they know who are earning a livelihood from growing and selling food. They can have access to those kinds of things for their own skills and an opportunity to find perhaps their own livelihood and to get involved. They understand the link of food and the food system to the health of their own community and the environment. So biodiversity, waste, pollution, clean water, clean air, and so on, because they know that those things are dependency for growing food and for selling food hygienically and so on. And then, opportunity. There are accessible opportunities for further entrepreneurship and development. There's local ownership of nodes of the food system. The development's happening at a local scale. There are local relationships. We're helping the farmers at Laritoli form their own cooperatives so they can have ownership and make their own decisions about how they want to run that food hub and their choices. And we're linking internationally with others who have done similar things, both in Africa, in Europe, and in the States. And look to kind of learn by doing and hopefully share with others what the paths are for this increased agency and control for farmers of these nodes in the food system. So we don't know how this is going to impact some of these other things. We're gathering data, we'll figure this out. We expect it will impact people's attitude, their behavior, their health, and the local economy. That's for the future. And I think last, just linking back to what Daniel said, I think it's important to also bear in mind that in a city like Cape Town, and I imagine many others in the world, we would do well to think about food culture and a contrast to foodie culture. And in a divided society that is one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal in the world, food cultures can be integrative, they can be shared, they can be connecting, whereas foodie cultures are often exclusive, elitist, and discriminating. And we very much want to celebrate talents and aesthetics and so on of food, but not at the exclusion of others who may not have the means or the interest in participating in that. So rather than building these barriers by celebrating foodie culture, we're very much focused on strengthening food culture in whatever way you participate in that. And I think that's an important nuance. So for more, if there are a number of talks and other things that are out there, Daniel and Solfina have mentioned some. I'm sure they'll share others with you. Again, we're not researchers and academics, it's stories from the trenches. And this last one I just want to mention is a talk that came from the food dialogues, which in 2020, which is something we ran. And today is the 1-year anniversary of the launch of the food dialogues last year. So I'm just going to say, please, if you're interested, have a look at fooddialogues.info. And there is a specific theme on food culture that was run. There are talks, there was a panel discussion, there's a section of the written food dialogues report that will be of interest to others. So thank you very much.
No, thank you very much, Kat, for that, for introducing really these different interactions with food, looking at food as therapy, looking at food as a tool for learning and education, food as a tool for building dignity, community engagement. It's a driver for infrastructure development at community level, as well as food as a source of income, among others. So this really is bringing us such a diverse array in which we interact with food, and we cannot ignore that anymore. if food is bringing in income, is food is bringing in health, or is contributing health and well-being, So then it should very much be at the center of how we're planning our cities, but then also how we're influencing different actors to plan around this. So thank you very much.
Absolutely.
For that.
Yeah, it's a point of leverage, and it's a radically inclusive place to start because we all eat, right? I mean, everyone has a stake. So I think it's beautiful in that way. Thanks, Solfina.
No, thank you very much for sharing with us. And please do share some links in the chat so that whoever is present is able to access the dialogues from last year. Thank you very much. So now I would like to invite Naibi, a photographer from Uganda, to share with us an experience on hidden flows and how food flows in Kampala City. So looking at especially issues around access to food, especially through informal channels. Welcome, Naibi. Hello, Naibi. If you're speaking, you're on mute.
Hello, can you get me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead to share your screen and then take us through your photography.
Yes, hello. Good from wherever you're logged in from. I hope everyone can hear my voice.
Yes, we can hear your voice. So you have 10 minutes to present.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, fine. I think they're enough because I think I won't go into too much talking as most of the talking has been already done by especially Daniel. I think he did he the whole insight as at what food is here in Africa and the world. So I think I'll be going straight away to the photos to see how it is in Uganda and the kinds of food we have in Uganda, which I think Africa maybe. If you see a food dish, we share maybe. I'll go straight to the photos. So here is a photo. I hope everyone can see it. This is a photo in Kampala. This is in the center, almost in the center of Kampala. It's around the city square of Kampala. And why I start with this photo is that in Kampala, the moment you stand anywhere, the first thing you land on is like with your eyes is food. Like food is everywhere. Everywhere they're selling food, everywhere from every corner, everywhere I can say. So from this photo, as you can see, there is a sugarcane juice maker and a samosa seller in Kampala, Uganda. Here, the samosa seller is in blue, and this other guy selling juice, sugarcane juice, is in white. They happen all to be at the same place, maybe, so that when someone buys a samosa, he can go ahead and also buy. Take with the samosa. So this is anywhere around Kampala. The first thing your eyes will see is food. So, as you can see in this photo, you can see there is a woman who's carrying plates of food on a big tray, trying to deliver it to her clients. What do I mean by her clients? These women are cooking food within the city center, but behind some huge malls somewhere and arcades, and they are the women who supply food to the workers within Kampala. Most people from who are working within Kampala are being supplied food by these kind somewhere far away from the city center, and deliver the food to their clients. Most of them are having clients who call either by phone call or send a message to deliver some food. Whenever, usually many women like this one here you see in Kampala at around from midday, from the time of midday, something like 2 p.m. where they are doing supplying food within all the shops in Kampala to the shop owners and any other person who stops them and they're like, hey, can you get me a plate of food? And as you can see here, a plate of 4,000, which is around $1, 4,000 shillings, Ugandan shillings, that's around $1. So go to the next photo. Here called Junior, deals in Nile perch fish. Nile perch fish, I'm not sure whether it's scattered all over Africa, but it's one of the biggest fish caught in Lake, and it is a delicacy for most Ugandans. It is a very huge fish. It's sold in, they chop it into ranging from a quarter kilo to a kilo. That's how, even sometimes they happen to fry it and they sell pieces for pieces around 1,000 shillings, Ugandan shillings. I think I'll go next. Yeah, here we look at Mr. Dennis here, who's a trader. By the time I took this photo, he was dealing in onions here. That day was dealing in onions. Why I say that day, most traders don't deal in one thing whenever they're in the market. If it's a season for onions, if the onions are plenty in the market, someone switches to selling onions. If tomorrow there are many tomatoes, the next morning you can wake up and you find they're dealing in tomatoes. So they keep switching according to what makes them money. By this day, he was dealing in onions, which I think most foods, almost every food, every recipe, there has to be an onion almost here in Uganda. They cook with onions first in the food. The next photo, as you can see, this is maize or corn. Some people call it corn, but this is maize here. It's also common here in Uganda. If you, especially in Kampala, almost around the streets everywhere, you're likely to see women who are roasting corn, and it's also some sweet and a common I can say common food within the country. And if it's not roast, then at least you're going to eat it as posho. That is the flour from maize, and which they used to make the posho as food. Yeah, that's it. Posho, I think I don't know whether we all call it posho around Africa, but I think in Kenya they call it, is it ugali, something like that, which comes from maize. I can push the next photo here. So also here around Kampala, there are very many roadside foods, I can say. As you can see in this photo, this lady is called Kevina. He's frying sweet potatoes for sale, and as you can see in the photo, usually this happens early in the morning, as most people use it as an escort with their breakfast. Here she was frying sweet potatoes for sale. This is an old woman, but this is a business that I think on which she survives. Where she earns a living by frying these potatoes here. On this photo, as you can see, also there is this is cassava. This is fried cassava, which is also a meal usually taken with breakfast. Usually, it's something common where you're moving around Kampala, and you're likely to see almost in every trading center or every neighborhood there is someone frying cassava. It's usually morning time, where most people use it as an escort to their tea or porridge. That is breakfast. Then we go to bananas. Yeah, as you know, here Uganda is known as some land of bananas. Here we have plenty of bananas. So here there's a woman carrying bananas for sale. And if you can see well clear in the background, you still see banana plantations around the same place. So this is very common. There are very many bananas around Uganda, from the yellow bananas to the matoke, the bananas from matoke, the food, which is prepared in banana leaves. So here, as you can see, this is a woman who's carrying bananas on her head, looking for customers. There are quite plenty of them when you're in the streets of Kampala, especially on Jinja Road. Very many women are selling bananas to passers-by, to people in cars while they are stuck in jam. Then earlier on, you talked about the Rolex. I had the Jinja Rolex. Kampala is also famous for the Rolex. How is a Rolex made? A Rolex is made by a Rolex. Here we call it a Rolex. Actually, in Uganda, most people mistake when you talk about a Rolex, they are surprised. But here in Uganda, we don't. Most of us don't wear Rolexes. We eat them. What is a Rolex? A Rolex is a roll whereby there are two chapatis and there is an egg, a fried egg, in between two chapatis. And when they roll it, it turns into a Rolex. It's some sweet food, street food you can find everywhere, almost also everywhere in Kampala. So here, as you can see, this is a young man frying chapati for sale by the street side. So they don't basically sell chapati, Rolex alone. They also sell chapati, or either you can order a Rolex. As I've told you, these are eggs, fried eggs rolled between chapatis. And also there's also another delicacy from the chapati mixed with beans, which is also common here in Kampala.
And can I request that you please wind up your presentation, just so that we can nicely wrap up discussions.
All right. So as you can see also here, a photo of a man hawking a watermelon fruit, of which he sells of cut pieces. Yeah, this is someone buys a big watermelon and they sell. They go around town by cutting off small pieces and selling them at a cheaper cost that is most affordable by most people. Also here there is a woman selling grasshoppers. If you can see very well, this woman here is selling grasshoppers, which are also very common in Kampala. Grasshoppers in Kampala, they are called insenene, and they are very common also. Usually there are seasons where they are very common, like in May and November. A very sweet insects there. Also here, another man here, you can see street vendors selling boiled eggs in Kampala, also, which are very common, and they're very, most especially they're eaten by people on the streets and motorcycle riders and taxi conductors. As you can see here, in the same area he is, there are very many taxis behind him. That's his biggest market for the egg eaters.
Yes. So maybe can you take us through the last couple of photographs? Then we can.
Actually, I'm winding up.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah. Also, as you can see here, street vendors selling pineapples in Kampala. That's how they sell the pineapples when the season is for pineapples. So just to wind up, I just managed to put up how does this food reach Kampala, especially the fruits, the cassavas, the sweet potatoes. As you can see, here is a pickup carrying some cassavas fresh from the garden, taking them to the market. And the last photo, I think this is, if you can see very well, this is also a truck. This is a truck selling with bags of onions for sale at wholesale price. It's from here where the traders come buy at wholesale price and they sell them at a retail price. Just next to the wholesaler truck, you can see some onions down being sold at retail price. Well, thank you everybody for following up, and I'm ready to take any question if there is any there.
Thank you very much, Naibi, for that presentation. And really, what strongly comes forward is really the issue around food and income, especially for informal actors in the food value chain, and then also the value in which or the significance in which street food or street is moving through. For example, street food traders in Kampala. This is food that is cooked, food that is easily accessed by different workers in the city, but then also food that is affordable. So then, why is it that when we are planning cities, what we call modern cities, some of these ways of food movement or food access, they are not being considered? Or how can they be better incorporated so that we ensure that different actors are accessing food at the right price, and then also employment is being provided to the people that most need employment? So thank you very much for that. So we are coming to the close of our webinar, and I would like to encourage you to please post in the chat any questions, and then to also leave any points of addition for our presentations. So now I would like to go on to the interview that we conducted with the founder of 57 Chocolate, Kimberly Addison. And so this may take us a few minutes over, but we'll try to focus on some of the key points coming out of this before we can eventually close off the webinar. And thank you for joining us this far. All right. Thanks for joining us, Kim. We're happy to have you for the third webinar of our African City Food Month event, which is Sustainable Food Cultures. And so I will not start by spilling the beans on who you are and what you're doing, but I'll let you get into it. So who are you, and what are you doing in Ghana with regard to food?
Okay, thank you for having me. Hi, everybody. My name is Kimberly Addison, and I am one of the co-founders of 57 Chocolate. So 57 Chocolate is the pioneer bean-to-bar manufacturing company located here in Accra, Ghana. And what we do is we take Ghana's raw cocoa and we transform it into luxurious confections and chocolates made from bean to bar. And why this is important is because Ghana was once the first largest producer of cocoa in the world. Now we're the second largest producer, just after Cote d'Ivoire. And together, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire produce more than half of the world's cocoa. Yet ironically, if you ask yourselves when you think about chocolate, I bet you probably think about places like Switzerland, Europe, the United States. Or if you think of any particular chocolate brands, most likely it's not an African chocolate brand. And that shouldn't be the case if most of the cocoa used in chocolate comes from Africa. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring manufacturing back to the continent, starting with Ghana, using a raw material that has been heavily exported and has had little value added here locally. And it's important because we're creating jobs, we're changing people's perspectives on what it means to produce in country and consume locally. And we're giving young people skill sets in chocolate making.
All right, no, thank you for sharing that. And it seems quite an interesting perspective that you're taking on, or an interesting approach, looking at a product that has been historically related to extraction from the continent, but you want to add value here and also add value to the lives of people that are part of this industry. And I know it hasn't been a very smooth journey for you, because you're almost getting onto the table with already established companies that have been working in the cocoa industry for quite a long time. So What are some of these setbacks that you have faced and actively working to address? First, especially seeing that this has been an historically extractive industry and benefiting a lot of Western processors and consumers.
So, I mean, there's been a lot of challenges in the sense that, first and foremost, I think one of the biggest challenges was getting people open to the idea of, you know, producing chocolate on a smaller scale, small batch artisanal chocolate. And so a lot of people are used to foreign brands. And so oftentimes there's been a stigma towards made in Africa products. So even just getting people's mindsets to change, that was a challenge. And also just systems in place, unfortunately, do not favor local businesses or small businesses. So in terms of, you know, taxing, in terms of import duties, they tend to favor the larger foreign companies. So that has also been a challenge. And then also basic challenges such as electricity, high electricity cost, electricity outages. Those are also huge challenges. And then another thing that people may not expect is even just human capital is another challenge. It's very ironic that we are the second largest producer of cocoa, but there's no real formal or informal training in chocolate making. So a lot of our employees, actually most of our employees, we've had to train just as we have been trained as well. And though we source cocoa from Ghana, another challenge is that a lot of other materials that we may use in chocolate or even to manufacture chocolate can't be found locally. So that means we're having to import certain things, which means that it's increasing our costs. So those have been some of our challenges that we've been dealing with.
And I can't imagine you talking about that for an industry that has existed in Ghana for quite a long period of time, you know, especially when you speak to issues around capacity building, you know, for something that has been going on for that long, how is it that people do not know how to create value out of such a high value crop, you know? So it's quite interesting, you know, looking at some of these things that we take for granted. But, you know, once we look into it, it's actually important to get the industry going locally. And you've been talking about mindsets, you know, changing people's mindsets about locally grown, locally made chocolate. And how is this going so far? Are you seeing more people interested in buying the product? Are you seeing more people promoting it, or you're finding yourself that most of it is exported to other markets other than Ghana?
So it's actually both. So we find that locally people have become very proud because not only are we making chocolate in Ghana, but even through our packaging and through our chocolate designs, we're trying to educate people on African art and history. So not only just Ghanaian art and history, but African art and history. So even on our packagings, you can see different places in Ghana. So a lot of people like to say that, especially in these COVID times, when they order our chocolates, that they feel like they visited Ghana without actually having to travel. And also people who are Ghanaian can, you know, look at the chocolate and see themselves reflected in it. You know, you're not just getting a regular European packaging that doesn't really have any meaning, but you're actually getting something that's symbolic of your culture. So it's been very positive, and a lot of local people have been very happy and very surprised that, wow, are you sure this is made in Ghana? And we're like, yes, it is. And equally, we're getting a lot of traction outside as well, because the reality is more people abroad consume chocolate than do locals, just because chocolate is still becoming more, it's still growing to be a cultural thing. So Ghanaians by nature don't eat a lot of chocolate. And that's something that I can see over the years is gradually changing, but I think it will shift sort of like how it shifted with China as the middle class rises. Because chocolate is it tends to be a more luxurious sort of food item. Yeah.
So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to that interview from Kimberly. The links to the website will be shared in the chat. You know, trying to revolutionize how we can take back power over some of the food that we're growing locally, how to add value to it, and how to make it relatable to the people of the continent, and then also adding value in terms of employment, in terms of and then also incomes, among other things. So that was Kimberly from 57 Chocolate in Ghana. Okay, so as we wind down our webinar, or as we come to the end of our webinar, I think first of all, we can't move away from the fact that food is central. You know, it's central to shaping how we interact with people. It's really key to our health and well-being. And we saw that a lot, especially during the COVID pandemic, you know, where access to food was limited in one way or another. And then also the need to move away from a passive relationship with food, but then to also push back and be able to make choices around our food. And this in turn will be able to shape the kinds of cities that we are living in. So as my colleague is posting in the chat, these conversations are part of African City Food Month. And this particular one, I can say, was very exploratory, looking at understanding, first of all, sustainability, food and culture all in one sentence. So if you have any additions to these conversations, please feel free to add this to the chat or share links to where we can get more information. But we shall share the presentations as well as the complete interview that we had with Kimberly. And thank you very much to our presenters, to Naibi, to Kat. Thank you for sharing your stories. And we hope we can continue these in further engagements. So with those few words, I'd like to close the webinar. Thank you very much.